Welcome to the Dream Novel channel. Before starting to listen to the fun in this clip, don't forget to like and comment, so that the admin will have the encouragement to continue making clips. Let's go listen. Channel Dream Novel. Chapter 146, Cedric the Great Savior. On the first day of the new school year, Fred and George were the undeniable center of attention. Even back in the Hufflepuff common room, students couldn't stop talking about their antics. "Do you really think the Weasley twins can actually sell that candy?" Cedric asked doubtfully, sinking into the sofa. "Professor McGonagall won't approve." "They probably won't make a big fuss," Kyle replied thoughtfully. "As long as they're careful not to get caught, they'll be fine. Technically, the rules do forbid dung bombs and fireworks in the castle, but we still see those all the time. The professors have too much on their plates to worry about every little thing." "That's different," Cedric argued, frowning. He remembered Fred and George mentioning that those sweets could help students skip class. Could the professors really overlook that? Kyle shrugged, not entirely certain. But he was pretty sure the twins already had a plan up their sleeves. As long as they didn't get caught in the act, the professors would likely just assume the sweets were from Zonko's or another joke shop. Worst case, they'd add fat tongue toffee to the list of banned items. As was tradition in Hufflepuff, the first week back meant a scramble to catch up on unfinished summer homework. With the common room growing more crowded, Kyle and Cedric gave up their seats to students hoping for some last-minute miracles and headed back to their dorm. The dorm looked just as it had last year, except for a new sign on the door reading, "Second Year." The room was spotless, as if the house elves had given it a thorough cleaning before term started. Kyle lay back on his bed, gazing at the familiar surroundings until he drifted off. Because he'd turned in early, Kyle woke before dawn the next day and decided to visit the 8th floor alone. When he reached the room of requirement, he found the flower beds in good shape, thanks to the room's natural environment simulation and the Mooncalf's regular soil fertilization, even after 2 months without tending. But there were definite changes. The Devil's Snare, closest to the Mooncalf's lair, had grown substantially. Its tendrils were now as thick as Kyle's wrist, darker in color, and more imposing. The chomping cabbages he'd planted before the holidays had also sprouted. Their fist-sized mouths opened and closed, and Kyle guessed they'd start growing teeth in another week or two. Nearby, the Dittany and Rue had spread into a dense, lush carpet of green. The Mooncalf was sound asleep, while the Billywig zoomed around joyfully. As soon as it spotted Kyle, it zipped over, its propeller-like wings buzzing with excitement. Kyle took a cautious step back, greeting it briefly before making his exit. The little creature seemed especially lively today, darting around Kyle with abandon, oblivious to the poisonous stinger it carried. Kyle wasn't about to risk getting stung. After leaving the room of requirement, Kyle made his way down to the Great Hall. It was already packed with students, who sat in clusters, whispering and sneaking glances toward the Gryffindor table. "There, look!" "Where?" "Next to the tall red-haired boy, the one with glasses. Harry Potter. Did you see his scar?" Harry looked distinctly uncomfortable under the scrutiny, keeping his head down as he hurried through his breakfast. Kyle joined the Hufflepuff table, where he found Fred and George in deep conversation with Cedric. "Cedric, please, you have to help us," Fred pleaded dramatically. "We didn't realize we'd have potions on the first day back, and if we don't hand in our homework on time, Snape will kill us," George finished, shuddering at the thought. Cedric chuckled. "I can lend you mine, but class starts soon. Are you sure you'll be able to finish it in time?" Fred nodded quickly. "Our potions lesson isn't until second period, so we'll finish it during divination." "All right, then," Cedric said, shaking his head with a smile. "I'll get it for you after breakfast." "You're a lifesaver." Fred and George beamed gratefully. "You've saved our lives." Kyle took a seat beside them and asked curiously, "So, you both chose divination?" "Divination and care of magical creatures," Fred replied. "Divination's a must. Charlie says it's an easy OWL, and the class is relaxed. Yep, George added. Professor Trelawney loves it if you make your predictions sound a little dramatic. That way, you can do whatever you like. You should consider it next year, it's practically paradise. Sounds tempting. Kyle nodded thoughtfully, then added, but if you can, I'd recommend taking study of ancient runes as well. Fred looked puzzled. Why's that? Isn't that class notoriously difficult? It's worse than difficult, George said with a grimace. Percy spent his entire holiday studying for it. That's true, Kyle agreed, but since you've both got your sights set on opening a joke shop, ancient runes would help a lot with alchemy. Alchemy? Fred and George exchanged glances, starting to catch on. Magical joke products were a type of alchemical creation, and if they wanted to make their own, ancient runes would indeed be valuable. Kyle, why did you wait until now to tell us something so important? George groaned, scratching his head. Now that the course selection deadline had passed, adding ancient runes would mean going to Professor McGonagall to request an extra course. It would be a big commitment, taking a fourth elective would take up their free time, cutting into their hours for mischief. But opening a joke shop was their dream, and if the class could really help with alchemy, they couldn't ignore it. Fred and George suddenly found themselves in a tough spot. Maybe we should just go talk to Professor McGonagall, George suggested after a moment. Do you think she'd let us replace care of magical creatures with ancient runes? Channel Dream Novel. Chapter 147, The Lost Harry and a Bag of Cat Food. If it had been just one more class, Professor McGonagall would probably have said yes. But another one. Honestly, Kyle didn't think it was likely. Still, seeing Fred and George's hopeful faces, he just shrugged and stayed silent. It wouldn't hurt to let them try. Maybe if Professor McGonagall was in a good mood, she'd agree. The first class of the year was Charms, and after leaving the lecture hall, Kyle said goodbye to the Weasley twins and Cedric, heading alone to the castle's 4th floor. While passing the 2nd floor, Kyle suddenly spotted 2 first-year students spinning helplessly on the stairs, Harry and Ron. They were stuck, circling around 2 trick steps, hovering on the 2nd floor, looking increasingly anxious. Kyle watched for a moment before he couldn't resist commenting, "What are you doing, getting in some exercise?" Ron's head whipped around, and seeing Kyle, he looked as if he'd spotted a savior. He grabbed Harry's arm and pulled him over. "We were trying to get to the Transfiguration classroom, but we got lost," Ron said breathlessly. "Could you tell us how to get there?" "Just follow me," Kyle replied. "I'm headed to the 4th floor too." "Thank goodness." Ron sighed in relief. "Thanks," Harry added, looking a bit embarrassed. "It's no trouble. It's on my way." Leading them toward the correct staircase, Kyle asked, somewhat puzzled, "Didn't you two buy a map of Hogwarts?" At this, Ron's face flushed, and he dropped his gaze, silent. Harry, also embarrassed, admitted, 20 galleons is way too expensive. We couldn't afford it. Although he had a good amount of gold in his vault, he hadn't brought much to school. After paying for his wand and books, he only had 20 galleons left. With the whole school year ahead, he wasn't keen on spending all his money on a map. "That's not what I meant," Kyle explained as they rounded a corner. "There are 2 kinds of maps. Besides the 20 galleon one, there's a cheaper version for 10 sickles." "What? Fred and George didn't tell you?" Harry and Ron froze. At Kyle's words, Harry suddenly remembered that there had indeed been a map flyer pinned to the common room door. He and Ron had both assumed it was like the pricey ones they'd seen on the train and hadn't looked closely at it. Now, thinking back, Harry's face crumpled with regret. If only he'd taken a closer look, he could still have managed 10 sickles. "Here we are. The Transfiguration classroom is that way," Kyle said, pointing, before slipping something from his pocket into Harry's hand. "Consider this a little something for our first meeting." Harry looked down and saw that he was holding 2 maps and a bag of dried fish. "What's this?" Ron asked. "It looks like cat food," Harry replied, puzzled. "Does Kyle have a cat?" Ron thought for a moment. Yeah, I think he does. Harry quickly looked up and called after him, Kyle, you gave us a bag of cat food by mistake. You can have it too. Kyle replied, already halfway down the hall and not looking back. I've got loads. You can feed it to the owls if you like. And with that, he disappeared around a corner at the end of the corridor. Harry stood there, stock still, holding the bag of dried fish. Come on, Harry, class is about to start. Ron suddenly tugged at him, his voice hurried. And it's Professor McGonagall's class, we really shouldn't be late. Okay. Snapping out of his daze, Harry stuffed the dried fish into his pocket and rushed after Ron toward the Transfiguration classroom. Meanwhile, Kyle had already entered the Charms classroom. For the first lesson of the new school year, Professor Flitwick didn't jump into new material but instead reviewed the charms they'd learned last year. He spent the first half of the lesson checking everyone's levitation charm and softening charm. Once he was satisfied that most students could cast these charms confidently, he returned to the platform where their textbooks were stacked. Today, we will be learning the general counterspell, which can cancel the effects of ordinary charms. Watch my movements closely. When you wave your wand, do it firmly, and enunciate clearly. Finite incantatem. After charms, Kyle headed to his History of Magic class. The afternoon was dedicated to 2 consecutive potions lessons with Professor Snape. As before, Snape didn't have a positive impression on Kyle. You were talking while brewing your potion, Snape said, his tone sharp and his expression grim as he loomed over Kyle. If you don't care to learn, at least don't disrupt others. 1 point from Hufflepuff. Then he turned to Kyle's partner, Conna. Excellent job preparing the lionfish spines, Conna, 1 point to Hufflepuff. Kyle regarded Snape with a calm expression, already accustomed to his blatant double standards. Compared to last year, when Snape had deducted 5 points on the first day, this was almost an improvement. The first day of the new school year passed like that. Some classes were less enjoyable than others, but overall, it felt fulfilling. That night, the library on the second floor of the castle was silent, not a single sound breaking the stillness. Tall shelves lined the room, casting long shadows that blocked out the faint moonlight slipping through the windows. It was much darker here than in the rest of the castle. Creak. The door suddenly cracked open, just enough for someone to slip through. Thud, thud. As the door closed, a series of clear, quiet footsteps sounded within the library. Filch is way too dedicated, isn't he? Muttered Kyle, lifting his disillusionment charm and patting his chest in relief. On the stairs earlier, Filch had appeared out of nowhere, passing close by Kyle. He had also noticed that Mrs. Norris, Filch's cat, had paused as she passed him, her gaze fixed on his spot with a suspicious expression. Kyle guessed she'd sensed something was off but couldn't quite place it. Fortunately, Filch seemed preoccupied with chasing someone else and urged Mrs. Norris to keep moving. It seems relying solely on the disillusionment charm for night walking isn't foolproof. I'll need to look into a spell that can mask scents, Kyle thought, steadying himself before heading toward the restricted section of the library. He remembered that the book he was looking for, the one detailing Horcruxes, was titled Secrets of the Darkest Art. But the thought of finding it gave him a headache. Though the restricted section only occupied a small part of the library, it still contained thousands of books. Without magic to assist him, locating Secrets of the Darkest Art would be no easy task. Hopefully, I can find it tonight, Kyle sighed, lighting his wand and stepping into the rows of shadowy bookshelves. Channel Dream Novel. Chapter 148, The Brave Savior. The next morning, Kyle entered the great hall with a yawn, faint dark circles shadowing his eyes. In his daze, he even headed toward the Slytherin table and almost took a seat there. Luckily, his friend Mikkel stopped him just in time. Kyle, what's up with you? Cedric asked, handing him a glass of milk. Didn't sleep well last night? Kyle sighed. He hadn't just not slept well, he hadn't slept at all. He'd spent the entire night in the restricted section and hadn't even come close to finding Secrets of the Darkest Art. Not a single mention of Horcrux had appeared in any of the texts he scanned. The closest he'd come was a vague line in a book titled Stir the Soul's Depths, find a vessel that carries your soul, and you will grasp the key to immortality. Other than that, it was a dead end. Some restricted section, he thought with annoyance. False advertising. Though he hadn't had enough time to search the entire section in one night, Kyle was already discouraged. It was clear that Dumbledore must have removed anything too telling about Horcruxes, leaving only scraps too vague to be of any use. Looking up, he saw the concern on his friends' faces. Forcing a smile, he shook his head. "It's nothing. I just had some weird dreams last night. Guess I'm just not used to them yet." "Weird dreams?" Cedric's brow furrowed. "Hufflepuff has divination today, doesn't it? Want me to ask Professor Trelawney?" Cedric had also opted to take divination, thanks to some nudging from Fred and George. "No," Kyle said with another yawn. "I was just reading all night in my dream. I think it's just the start of term excitement. I'll probably be fine tomorrow." The others glanced at each other before awkwardly turning away. Reading all night, even in his dreams. This was a level of dedication they couldn't quite relate to. Even Cedric couldn't help a slight twitch at the corner of his mouth but chose not to say anything further. "Hey, let me tell you something interesting," Mikkel chimed in, leaning closer with a mischievous glint in his eye. "Last night, I heard from some first years that Harry Potter and Ron Weasley from Gryffindor actually tried to feed Professor McGonagall dried fish during Transfiguration class." "Feed Professor McGonagall?" Cedric repeated, intrigued and clearly amused. "Seriously?" He knew that Professor McGonagall liked to demonstrate her animagus form in the first class of the year, but he never imagined someone would be bold enough to provoke her. In Cedric's mind, it had to be deliberate. After all, who would just bring dried fish to class for no reason? They must have known in advance about her transformation into a cat. "Yes, really," Mikkel said, trying to keep a straight face. "It's all over the school by now." That first year, Justin Finch-Fletchley said they were practically chucking dried fish across the room like they were feeding strays. Professor McGonagall's face went green, and she made them stand and listen to the whole lecture as punishment. Mikkel finally lost control, bursting into laughter until he was nearly doubled over, clutching his stomach. Cedric also couldn't resist laughing, though not quite as uproariously as Mikkel. Kyle, curious, glanced over at the Gryffindor table. There, Harry and Ron sat huddled in the corner, looking embarrassed, while Fred and George stood beside them, laughing heartily and clapping them on the shoulders. They seemed to view the incident as a legendary prank, one worthy of admiration. "These new first years sure have some nerve," Kyle remarked, turning back to his breakfast. He picked up a piece of toast, layered it with fried egg and ham, and took a bite. When he'd finished eating, he tapped his fingers on the table and said softly, "Could I have a cup of black tea?" As he finished speaking, a steaming cup of black tea appeared in front of him, accompanied by a small jar of sugar. Kyle lifted the cup, tested its temperature, and found it just right before taking a long drink. "Please, another cup." After downing 2 cups of black tea in a row, Kyle finally started to shake off his drowsiness. Just to be safe, though, he ordered a 3rd cup. Today was the first Transfiguration class of the term, and he knew that if he dozed off, his fate might be even worse than Harry's. After leaving the Great Hall, the group bid farewell to Cedric and made their way to the Transfiguration classroom on the 4th floor. Kyle couldn't help but notice that Professor McGonagall seemed even stricter than usual, maybe because of what happened yesterday. Unlike Professor Flitwick, McGonagall didn't allow time for students to review last year's spells. She dove straight into the new lesson, transforming a beetle into a button. This spell was more challenging than anything they'd done last year. Not only was it a detailed transformation, but the beetles themselves were constantly on the move, and not slowly, either. Mikkel gave it a go, waving his wand carefully, but after several attempts, all he managed to accomplish was making his beetle move around a bit more. Ryan, however, thought he'd found a shortcut and pinched his beetle between his fingers to keep it still. But just as he raised his wand, Professor McGonagall appeared beside him, her voice stern. "I already told you, didn't you hear me? You are not allowed to touch the beetle with your bare hands. Or are you looking to lose a few fingers?" The beetle, so small between his fingertips, would be easy to miss with the spell, and misfires could end poorly. Last year, a similar mistake had left one unfortunate student with fused fingers, resulting in a 2-day stay in the hospital wing. Ryan winced, muttering, "Professor McGonagall, I forgot." 3 points from Hufflepuff, she replied with a disapproving look before moving on. After witnessing that exchange, the others quickly abandoned any creative ideas, sticking to simply chasing their beetles around the table. They weren't having much luck, though. The beetles were far more nimble than expected, and as the students grew increasingly frustrated, their wand movements became sharper and more forceful. The classroom filled with the sounds of crackling spells and occasional misfires, and sparks shot off in all directions as impatience took hold. One by one, the beetles met unfortunate ends. Some were flattened by overly aggressive wand taps, while others were blasted into bits. Professor McGonagall's expression grew darker with every casualty, her displeasure palpable as the beetle casualties continued to mount. Channel Dream Novel. Chapter 149, The Dark Wizard and the Fraudulent Professor. Kyle chuckled at Kanna's transfiguration attempt, her beetle turn button still sporting tiny beetle legs, making it look like a peculiar, stubby tortoise. Pfft. Kanna quickly covered the half-transformed beetle, scowling at him. "What are you laughing at? You're probably not any better than me." Kyle just shrugged and silently waved his wand over his own beetle. In an instant, it transformed into a neat, button-like shape, complete with a delicate turtle pattern engraved on top. A murmur of admiration spread through the class as other students noticed his success. None had expected anyone to master the spell so quickly. Even Professor McGonagall seemed surprised, but she gave a small nod of approval, holding up Kyle's button for everyone to see. 10 points to Hufflepuff, she announced with a rare smile. Kyle glanced over at Kanna, giving her a casual shrug. She flushed with annoyance, turning her head away in silent frustration. By the end of class, Kanna had finally succeeded in turning her beetle into a button, too. As a reward, Professor McGonagall exempted both Kyle and Kanna from the assignment, while the rest of the class groaned under the weight of a 2-foot essay on transfiguration theory, due before the next lesson. Outside the classroom, Michael's face was pale as he muttered repeatedly, still in shock. A typical 10-inch essay was grueling enough, but 2 feet. It felt like torture. Mikkel turned to Kyle, eyes pleading. "Help me, please, just this once. Let me copy your assignment." "Sorry," Kyle replied, patting his shoulder sympathetically. "You forgot, I don't have to write it." The hope in Michael's eyes vanished instantly. After transfiguration, everyone eagerly anticipated their defense against the dark arts class. Oren was a dark wizard, but his practical lessons had captivated the students, sparking a genuine interest in the subject within just 1 school year. Professor Quirrell's classroom was on the 3rd floor. It was a cramped, dimly lit room, far smaller than last year's, with only one small window that barely let in any daylight, making the space feel even gloomier. As they entered, a strange unease settled over the students, deepened by Professor Quirrell's arrival. Who could make a room smell so strongly of garlic? The stench was overwhelming, almost as if the garlic were somehow alive. Several students instinctively covered their noses and attempted to open the window, but Professor Quirrell stopped them. "And no, we can't open the window," he stammered. I was attacked by a zombie over the summer and cursed. I see can't be exposed to the wind." He gestured to his oversized scarf. "This is a gift from an African prince I saved. It protects me." "A zombie?" The students were instantly intrigued. Katie Bell from Gryffindor couldn't resist asking, "Professor Quirrell, what does a reanimated zombie look like?" "It has inch-long fangs, a body like steel, and is immune to charms," utterly terrifying," he replied. "Wow," gasped the students, looking at Quirrell with newfound respect. "A creature immune to charms and tough as steel? Even an Auror would struggle against something like that." Suddenly, Professor Quirrell's unassuming demeanor took on a heroic air, and even the strong smell of garlic didn't seem so bad. "He must have encountered a vampire on his journey and uses the garlic to keep it away, afraid it might return," someone whispered confidently. "Garlic is a vampire's worst enemy." Professor Quirrell looked at the student in surprise, then nodded silently. It was a much better explanation than he'd managed to come up with. "Professor Quirrell," Katie asked eagerly, "if the zombie was so powerful, how did you defeat it? Can you tell us?" "Well, Quirrell's face reddened as he stammered, "It was, like this, and then, like that. It involved very advanced magic, so even if I told you, you wouldn't understand." Seeing him struggle to explain, the students exchanged doubtful glances. His stammering only made him seem less believable. Katie was relentless, pressing further, "It's all right, Professor. Even if we don't understand, we can look up any advanced charms in the library." The others chimed in eagerly. "Yes, Professor. Just tell us, please. A few words will do." Professor Quirrell's face flushed even redder. After an awkward silence, he avoided their questions entirely, glancing out the window instead. "I don't like the weather in England," he mumbled. "Too much rain. Romania is very nice." This confirmed everyone's suspicions. Clearly, Professor Quirrell had made up the story. He hadn't encountered any zombies. Disappointment washed over the students. While they had worried that this year's defense against the dark arts professor might be less than competent, they hadn't expected he'd turn out to be a liar. And a liar who reeked of garlic, no less. This was even worse than Oren. Interest in the lesson vanished. The students began amusing themselves with quiet distractions. Some were writing letters, others catching up on homework, while a few entertained themselves by playing with toads. Professor Quirrell noticed but said nothing. Instead, he merely opened Dark Forces, a self-defense guide, and began to read aloud in a monotonous drone. Anyone observing would have thought Professor Binns had possessed him. Kyle struggled to keep his eyes open, the drowsiness almost overwhelming. For a moment, he found himself actually missing Oren. Both had been dark wizards, but how could there be such a difference between them? Forcing himself to stay alert, Kyle finally made it to the end of class. "That was awful," Kanna complained over lunch. "I really don't understand why the headmaster would let him teach defense against the dark arts." "Maybe they really couldn't find anyone else," Cedric suggested after a thoughtful pause. "As you know, it's always been hard to find professors willing to take that position." "But that doesn't mean they should just read from the textbook," Kanna protested. "If that's all they're going to do, they might as well hire a ghost like Professor Binns. At least then they wouldn't have to worry about the curse." Cedric opened his mouth to respond, but paused, considering her point. For once, it actually seemed to make a lot of sense. Channel Dream Novel. Chapter 150, Cedric's Unbearable Memories. The incident with Professor Quirrell didn't keep them distracted for long. Cedric recounted that the previous defense against the dark arts professor, the one before Oren, was actually even worse than Quirrell. Back then, Cedric had just started at Hogwarts, a first-year student brimming with dreams and endless expectations. Unfortunately, that excitement faded in less than 2 days. In their first defense against the dark arts class, the professor cast a series of vicious jinxes on the students under the guise of teaching. There was the vomiting jinx, the horn-growing hex, the hair-thickening jinx, the jelly legs jinx, and the swelling head jinx. Cedric had experienced them all. While the professor always managed to reverse the effects in time, ensuring no lasting harm, the experience of being jinxed was extremely unpleasant. The swelling head jinx, in particular, left him with a dizzying discomfort he remembers all too vividly. To make matters worse, the professor pitted classmates against each other, dividing them into 2 groups from different houses and forcing them to duel with jinxes. For Cedric, each defense against the dark arts class felt like torture, leaving him needing days to recover afterward. Thankfully, these ordeals didn't last long. Cedric explained that on Halloween, a large group of heavily armed people stormed into Hogwarts and took the professor away. Initially, everyone assumed he was some dark wizard. But a few days later, the Daily Prophet revealed that he was actually an escaped patient from St. Mungo's Hospital, one from the psychiatric ward. After Cedric finished, Kyle and Conna stared at him in disbelief. "It's true," Cedric said, shrugging as he caught sight of their shocked faces. "If you don't believe me, you can ask the Weasley brothers. They know, too." Kyle shook his head, feeling a pang of sympathy for Cedric and the Weasley brothers. Truly, anyone bold enough to apply for the position of defense against the dark arts professor at Hogwarts had to be extraordinary. With Cedric's experience as a benchmark, Professor Quirrell's classes suddenly didn't seem so bad anymore. But by the time herbology class rolled around in the afternoon, any lingering thoughts about defense against the dark arts had completely faded. The magical greenhouse number 3 was an absolute paradise for magical plants. Mandrakes, venomous tentacula, snargaluff, plants they had only read about or heard of before, were all right here. "Today, we're going to repot mandrakes," announced Professor Sprout, pointing to a row of deep-bottomed trays beside her. "Now, can anyone tell me the properties of mandrakes?" Cho, who was in their class, raised her hand first. "Mandrake is a powerful restorative," she answered confidently. "It's used to return deformed people or those under a charm to their original state." "Very good. 10 points to Ravenclaw," said Professor Sprout, nodding in approval. "Mandrake is indeed essential in many antidotes. But it's also quite dangerous. Can anyone tell me why?" "The cry of a mandrake root can kill a person," blurted out a boy in the middle of the class. "Exactly right. Ravenclaw, another 10 points, said Professor Sprout. At that moment, she glanced at Kyle with a hint of regret. This child is just too polite, she thought. In the classroom, just raising your hand isn't enough. Sometimes it's best to just speak up, like that Ravenclaw boy. What a missed opportunity for a few extra points. Just as she was thinking this, Professor Sprout noticed that Kyle's hand was still raised. "Oh, Kyle, did you have something to add?" she asked. "Yes, Professor," Kyle replied. "In addition to its cry, dried mandrake leaves are also dangerous for animagi." "Yes, you're correct," Professor Sprout said, though she quickly shook her head slightly. "But not as dangerous as you might think. In fact, the effects of dried mandrake leaves on animagi are quite weak and only cause irreversible harm if taken consistently in animal form over a long period, about 3 years, at least. And if the wizard reverts to human form during that time, the negative effects disappear instantly. Furthermore, there aren't many animagi in the wizarding world. Only 7 are registered with the Ministry of Magic. As far as I know, none of them spend extended periods in animal form, much less consume mandrake leaves. So, although mandrake leaves do affect animagi, the likelihood is extremely slim. In fact, aside from 100 years ago, there's no other recorded case." "Oh, I see," Kyle nodded thoughtfully. "I guess I was just being paranoid." "No, I'd say you've just been reading a lot," Professor Sprout remarked with a smile. "I remember only one rather obscure herbalism book that mentions that incident." "What was it called?" "A Selection of Medieval Herbs," Kyle answered. "I read it at Mr. Scamander's." "Yes, that's the one," Professor Sprout chuckled. Everyone knows Mr. Scamander as a brilliant magizoologist, but few realize he was also a master of herbology. 10 points to Hufflepuff, Professor Sprout added with a clap of her hands. "This is just a bit of extra information for you all. Don't worry about memorizing it." She then pointed again to the row of deep trays and began explaining the precautions for repotting mandrakes. 4 to a tray. "And remember, you must wear earmuffs," Professor Sprout reminded them. "While the mandrakes here are still young and their cries aren't fatal, they can make you faint for several hours." I don't think any of you want to miss the first day of classes, so make sure to wear your earmuffs while working. When it's time to pack up, I'll find a way to get your attention. With their earmuffs on, repotting the mandrakes wasn't difficult as long as they were careful to keep fingers and hands away from the plants' mouths. Though the mandrakes lacked teeth, their mouths were lined with hard keratin, making bites painful. Kyle grabbed a bunch of leaves and expertly yanked the mandrake out of its pot. The little creature immediately let out a loud wail, wriggling its light green body in resistance. It seemed much louder than the others, and it was clearly not happy with Kyle. "You're such a fuss, it's barely worth it to pull a few leaves off," Kyle muttered as he took a large flower pot from under the table and stuffed the mandrake into it. Now the fun in this clip is over. Which listeners haven't liked and commented yet? You can press like and comment to encourage the admin find the fun in the next clip. May the listeners be happy forever.